is Alexey Soshin. I'm a contributor to the Exposed framework, and I'm a big fan of it. And today I wanted to talk about a few less known features of that framework. Most of the examples here come from the questions asked on GitHub issues of the Exposed project or on Stack Overflow, and some of those questions like I answered or I was wondering about. About the title of my talk, for those that are unfamiliar with 7 plus minus 2, it's the number of things we can hold in our short-term memory. And in this case, it's just an escape hatch for me, so I don't need to commit exactly how many topics I'm going to cover. Having said that, let's start with a quick raise of hands, please. How many here are using Hibernate or some other form of JPA in production? Okay, 5, 6, okay. And how many of you use Exposed in production? Okay, cool. That's great, thank you. It's just for me to understand how much time I need to spend on discussing what Exposed framework is and its syntax. Also to check who is here either came to the wrong talk or just didn't have coffee in the morning. So to set the scene, this is how I usually worked with databases before discovering the Exposed framework. This is from the official Spring Data GitHub example. It's in Java in this case. To be clear, my intention is not to mock JPA or Hibernate in any way. Those are great frameworks. This is just so I could compare apples to apples, so to say, and give you some examples in Exposed, what they look like. The top example here uses an annotation on an interface and a special language that describes what data should we fetch at runtime. And the bottom example uses some conventions, like starting the method name with an action, like remove, and specifying the columns used in the name of the method. In both cases, you have zero support from your language. If you have an active database connection and your IDE is very smart, then you may get some support, some auto-completion, but still not much. Now, when JetBrains were working on the Kotlin language, one of their goals was to create a language that would be great for creating DSLs. Funny fact, you can look at the code of the Exposed library and you will see a lot of commits from their CTO, from the JetBrains CTO, which is super impressive. That was how he tested the limits of the new language his company was creating. What do you get as a result when you use the Exposed library? It provides you with a SQL DSL, so there is no need to write your SQLs in strings as we've seen earlier, and also no need to remember what the function naming conventions are. So you get type safety provided by the Kotlin compiler and not by plugin or the IDE. And you get auto-completion as a bonus, and that's all just from using those language DSL constructs. So here on the top example, we see how you can do the same query we've seen earlier with Exposed, where we operate on a user's table, we have a select block, and then you can convert the results to list. And the bottom example demonstrates how would you do a delete. So similar to the Spring examples, to the JPA example, where you operate still on a table and you do delete where, and you have that nice DSL block to specify what you delete Now, if you prefer to work with objects instead of queries, Exposed Framework also provides a DAO API. Here you can see that we invoke methods on the entity, and instead of select, they are called find. Instead of writing a delete query, with DAO API, you would just invoke a delete method on each object. Whether to use the SQL DSL or the DAO API has a lot to do with preferences of your team or company. DAO, in my opinion, is simpler, and SQL DSL is more powerful. You can do more things in it. But this talk is not the convince my company to use Exposed talk. This talk is about things you may not know about. So let's start with the first point, logging queries. The usual way you log queries in Exposed is by adding a logger to the transaction. So that transaction block is how you open transactions in Exposed. And then inside it, you can define a logger. This is the standard logger. And when you run the queries, each query that you run gets printed to the console like this, which is nice. But there is another way to inspect just a single query that you may have not known about. You can invoke prepareSQL method on the query, and it will return you the query as a string. This is useful if you want to run this query yourself or do like explain plan on it, for example. There is a subtle difference between this and using a logger, though. The prepareSQL method won't execute the query at all. It will return the SQL, but won't run it, while the logger prints the query as you try to run it. That's why you also can see that here we have a question mark at the bottom, because the parameters weren't actually replaced, while in the previous example you can see that there is somewhere here the name already being placed in the query. If you worked with Exposed, you may have noticed that it supports different column types out of the box, like the standard things, integer, varchar, and all that, but not dates. If you want to use dates, and usually like in the database there are a lot of dates columns, you need to pick one of the free libraries. And it really confused me at the beginning when I started to work with Exposed. So let's talk about why is that and which library is the correct one. So the reason that you need to specify the date library explicitly is that Exposed was one of the first Kotlin libraries, as I mentioned. Like JetBrains literally developed it as they were developing the language. And they started developing it when Java 7 was still around. And Java 7 didn't have a good date support. Back in the day, everyone was using JodaTime library for dates because it was much nicer, much more intuitive. And so did JetBrains in their projects. So they are really big on dogfooding, and they were using JodaTime in their already running projects. So it was natural for them to use the JodaTime to represent dates in Exposed as well. When Java 8 came out, the Exposed team added support for the date library it came with. So now we have two libraries, JodaTime and JavaTime. And then a few years ago, Kotlin has added its own datetime library, mainly for the sake of Kotlin multi-platform, to disconnect a bit from the JVM dependency. And so there are free libraries to pick from now when you work with Kotlin Exposed, and that's the reason. If your project is pure Kotlin, you should use datetime and the Kotlin one. In other cases, use a JavaTime library if it's some kind of a mixed project. And I don't think there is a good reason to use JodaTime nowadays, unless your project like explicitly uses it and you want to integrate it with Exposed. Next topic. When you work with relational databases, you often need to represent a many-to-many relationship. For example, here we have users that can be assigned to groups. A single user can be in multiple groups, and groups, of course, have multiple users. Otherwise, those aren't really groups. So first, let's look at the connection table that connects users to groups and how we map it in Exposed. This mapping doesn't have anything special in its definition, and the only thing I want to show you here is that this connection table in our code is called members, because we will use that later. So, some may know, some may not know that in Exposed, many-to-many relationships are defined using a via function. So inside, when we describe our entity, we can use a via function, and that will establish that it's a many-to-many relationship. And if we look at the group entity and focus on the definition on the last line, we'll see that we fetch users via the members table that we've seen earlier, using the group ID column as source and user ID column as target. And just to drive that point home, here is how it looks from the user perspective. So again, we say that we fetch groups via the members table, and now the source is the user, and the target is the groups that user belongs to. So Exposed supports these many-to-many relationships. It works great. So if you need it, that's how we do it. The next feature, in my opinion, is pretty well documented, but we still get a lot of questions about, so I decided to cover it anyway. And when I say we, I mean we as contributors to the Exposed. It's an open source project. I don't work myself for JetBrains. So coroutines and suspending functions, as you all know, you're all Kotlin developers, are one of the Kotlin killer features. They allow us to run thousands of coroutines and be efficient about I/O. And for those reasons, a lot of functions, a lot of libraries in Kotlin use coroutines and suspending functions, which is great. But you can't invoke suspending functions from the Exposed transaction block. And that's how you interact with database in Exposed. You always need to open a transaction block first. And that's because the transaction block is not a suspending function itself. So here we have a simple suspending function, just waits for 10 milliseconds, doesn't return anything, and we try to invoke it from the transaction. When we do that, we'll get a compilation error saying like, you need to be invoked from either a suspending function or a coroutine. And the way to overcome this in the Exposed library is to use new suspended transaction instead of just a simple transaction. It's provided by the Exposed library itself. You don't need another dependency for that. And the new suspended transaction is a suspending function. So from that block, you can invoke other suspending functions as usual, no problem there. You can also nest suspended transactions. For that, we have the suspended transaction function, so without the new word. If you need some fine-grained control over your transaction and you're using Exposed, you can definitely have it. You can open a transaction and inside it open an inner transaction, and if any part of that fails, everything will be rolled back. Now you would ask, like, why would I even do like transaction inside the transaction? So often the cases is that you extract that into a function, so the suspended transaction will be inside some inner function. One subtle detail is that if you decide to use new suspended transaction inside another new suspended transaction, it will do exactly as you tell it to do, and it's sometimes unexpected that it's so exact. What this block will do compared to the previous block is that it will open a completely new transaction. So if the outer transaction rolls back, the inner transaction won't roll back because it's a new transaction, it's completely disconnected, and it won't roll back, it will commit. Sometimes you want that behavior, sometimes you don't. So be aware of it and pick carefully between those two blocks. Usually you would like to open one new suspended transaction and then just do regular suspended transactions inside. This is, I think, is a rare case, but I've seen some people ask about it, whether it's a bug or not. So yeah, it's not a bug, but it's a rare case to be used. Next, let's look at the following SQL query someone tried to rewrite with exposed. The SQL part looks pretty straightforward. There is a varchar type column that says if a message was seen or not. If it wasn't seen, we map it to null. Otherwise, we map it to 1. And then we count how many messages, seen messages there are. And count function ignores nulls. That's how it works in SQLs. So there may be some SQL experts in the room that would say it could be rewritten in such a way that the null is made completely redundant if you switch the order of the cases. But let's assume that person that wrote that query absolutely had to have that null here for some reason. So the way you would try to write it in exposed is by using the case builder we have from the standard library. And for those that don't work with exposed, slice function is just exposed way of specifying which columns you want to query. So otherwise it will be like a star. As you can see, this is pretty similar to the SQL query. And you get auto-completion, so it isn't that hard to write. But the problem here is you cannot pass that null as a string to your SQL builder, and you also can't pass Kotlin's null. So it's not very intuitive what should you do in this case to rewrite that query. The way that problem can be solved is by using a nullop exposed provides. So nullop is an expression, and the value it returns is the SQL representation of null. Now, since case is also an expression, the outer block, and its result is the number of the read messages user has, or something like that, we need to specify the type of the null. And the type of that null, in this case, is integer. That's why we have that null op int there. If we were allowed to rewrite the query slightly and have that null op in the else case, for example, then Kotlin generic types inference would kick in, and we wouldn't have to specify the type of the null anymore. So that simplifies our query a bit. I mentioned earlier that exposed has two syntaxes, and I show both of them. So there is a SQL syntax and there is the DAO syntax. Sometimes you would have a complex query that you've written with the exposed SQL DSL, and now you want to convert its results to DAO entities. Of course, you can do that by mapping them yourself, but there is a better way to do that. There is a method called wrap_rows in exposed that is available on each entity. It takes the query and it attempts to map it. So there is no need to do that work manually. Exposed can do it for you. And in some cases, there's also a method that is called a rep row. So rep rows will invoke rep row on each result row. If you just need a single row repped, transformed, you can do that as well. Well, I think that's my final point for today. Now, I talked a lot about how the aim of the exposed framework is to provide a type-safe and ergonomic way to work with databases. And I hope that I showed a few tricks how to do that efficiently. Maybe I even convinced some of you to give exposed a try. But sometimes a database feature is too specific or too new for us to implement it yet in this version of the library. So there is an exec method available to you inside every transaction, and that method will execute an arbitrary prepared statement. And this method exposes a low-level Java API, so you have an awkward iterator and indexes that start with 1. So not really recommended, but that option is left to you if you really need to do something very special. Well, let's quickly recap the things you may have not known. In exposed, you can log a single query, no need to log all of them. We discussed why exposed requires you to pick the date library you work with, and that by default you should just pick the Kotlin date time. Exposed provides you with a flexible way to define many-to-many relationships using via function. There is a coroutine support. Many people ask about that. So if your code uses suspending functions, it's not a problem for exposed. You just start with new suspended transaction, and then everything should work. If you need to use nulls in your query, like you're doing some joins, or as we see in some cases, there is a special expression for that exposed provides. You also don't have to map SQL DSLs to entities manually. Exposed can do that for you. And finally, you can break exposed and use arbitrary statements if that's really what you have to do. This is all the features I wanted to talk about today. If you have questions on how to use some of the exposed features, me and other contributors will be happy to answer them on Stack Overflow. If you find any bugs related to the exposed library, you can open a GitHub issue and the team will look into it. And if you have an idea for improving the library, pull requests are more than welcome. If you're interested to learn more about the exposed framework, I just finished recording the first course on exposed for LinkedIn Learning. It should be out beginning of the next year. And thank you for coming to my talk. If you enjoyed it, you can follow me on LinkedIn, Medium, or Twitter. I'm an author of a video course on system design that is published on Udemy. So if you're interested in software architecture, there is a coupon. I should have put it in a larger font, but that's the coupon. You get the course for free. And also, I'm an author of Kotlin design patterns, so check it out on Amazon. Last thing I wanted to say, as someone who was born in Ukraine, thank you for all your support. Glory to Ukraine. Enjoy the rest of the great conference, and thank you very much for coming.